Ethan Vance, a reclusive Special Ops veteran, thought he had left the war behind. But last night's blizzard changed everything. Deep in the whiteout, he found a life fading fast. A pregnant German shepherd, battered and nearly buried alive. He thought it was a simple rescue. He was wrong. When he saw the slashed military coat in her ear, Ethan realized the terrifying truth. She wasn't lost. She was a living weapon on the run. And the ones hunting her were monsters in human skin. Dragged back into the fray, the man who ran from the world must now fight a lonely, deadly war in the wilderness to protect this four-legged friend. Will their bond be enough to defeat the evil closing in? Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to hit subscribe. Hold on to your hearts. The storm starts now. The Rockies screamed. A white void devouring the world as the blizzard turned the landscape into a suffocating tomb of ice. Ethan Vance pushed against the gale, his boots crunching through knee-deep drifts that felt like wet concrete. The isolation of the mountains usually a balm to his fractured soul, but tonight feeling more like a tightening noose. At 42, Ethan was a man carved from granite and regret. His 6'3" frame lean and roped with muscle that had been forged in the crucible of special operations and hardened by years of solitary living. His beard, once dark, was now heavily streaked with the premature gray of a man who had seen too much death in the sandbox of Kandahar, and his eyes, the color of chipped flint, constantly scanned the perimeter with a hypervigilance that no amount of therapy or whiskey could dull. He was a ghost haunting his own life, preferring the biting cold of the high altitude to the suffocating pity of civilization, where loud noises made his hands shake and crowds made his breath catch in his throat. He was checking the perimeter fence, a mundane task that tethered him to reality when his mind threatened to drift back to the blood-soaked sands of his past, when a sound cut through the shrieking wind, not the groan of timber or the howl of a coyote, but a low, desperate keen that sounded terrifyingly human. He froze, his gloved hand instinctively dropping to the knife at his belt, his heart hammering a rhythm that had nothing to do with the cold. The sound came again, faint and rapidly fading, leading him toward a cluster of wind-twisted pines near the jagged edge of the property line where the snow swirled in violent eddies. There, half buried under a fresh avalanche of powder, lay a mound of dark fur that looked pitifully small against the endless white. Ethan dropped to his knees, digging frantically until he uncovered the head of a German shepherd, her sable coat matted with ice and old blood that had frozen into jagged crystals against her skin. She was massive, clearly not a house pet, with the broad chest and powerful muzzle of a working dog, but now she was reduced to a shivering skeleton, her eyes glazed over with the milky film of hypothermia. As Ethan ran his hands over her trembling flank to check for broken bones, his fingers brushed against a swollen, taut belly, and the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. She was pregnant, heavily so, and she was dying. The soldier in him, the combat medic who had packed wounds under mortar fire, took over the broken man. He stripped off his heavy outer coat, wrapped it around the animal, and hoisted her 80-pound frame onto his shoulders, groaning as his bad knee, a souvenir from an IED, protested the weight. The journey back to the cabin was a blur of agony and determination, the wind trying to tear the burden from his back, but Ethan held on, driven by a stubborn refusal to let one more innocent thing die on his watch. He kicked open the door of his cabin, a rush of heat and the scent of burning pine welcoming them, and laid the dog gently on the rug before the roaring stone hearth. The cabin was sparse, utilitarian, reflecting the mind of its owner. No photos on the walls, just tools, books, and the silence he usually craved but now filled with his own ragged breathing and the dog's shallow rasps. He worked with efficient, trembling hands, drying her fur with rough towels, checking her gums which were pale as parchment, and forcing drops of sugar water down her throat. She was a fighter. He could see it in the way her ears flickered even in her stupor, a stoicism that mirrored his own. As the warmth of the fire began to penetrate her frozen core, Her body suddenly seized, a ripple of muscle tearing through her exhausted frame, and Ethan realized the trauma of the storm had induced labor. For the next 4 hours, the world outside ceased to exist. There was only the crackle of the fire, the smell of wet fur and copper, and the miracle of life fighting to emerge from the shadow of death. Ethan murmured soft, nonsensical comforts, his voice rough from disuse, as he guided the first puppy into the world, then the second, third, and finally a fourth. The mother, completely spent, licked her offspring with a devotion that made Ethan's chest ache with a familiar, hollow grief he thought he had buried. She was a survivor, a warrior who had dragged herself through hell to ensure her lineage survived, and looking at her, Ethan felt a kinship he hadn't felt with any living being in a decade. He cleaned her up, wiping away the birthing fluids and the grime of the wilderness, and as he gently cleaned her ears, his thumb brushed against the inner cartilage of her left ear. He paused, leaning in closer to the firelight to inspect what looked like scar tissue. It was a tattoo, the standard identification mark of a military working dog or a high-level police K-9, but it had been brutally defaced. Someone had taken a blade and deliberately slashed through the alphanumeric code, turning the badge of honor into a jagged, keloid mess of unrecognizable lines. A surge of cold, white-hot rage flooded Ethan's veins, sharper than the blizzard outside. This wasn't an accident or a stray dog wandering off a farm. This was a highly trained asset that had been discarded, erased, and left to rot. He looked into her tired, amber eyes, which watched him with a startling intelligence, and whispered, "Valkyrie," naming her after the choosers of the slain, for she had surely walked through the valley of death tonight and decided to return. She rested her heavy head on his hand, a gesture of absolute trust that terrified him more than any enemy combatant ever could, because it meant he was no longer just a ghost haunting a cabin. He was a guardian again, and the war he thought he had left behind had just found him on his own doorstep. The blizzard had retreated, leaving behind a world sculpted in blinding white silence, but inside the cabin, a different kind of tension had taken root. 3 days had passed since the birth, and while the puppies were thriving, wriggling balls of warmth nursing blindly against their mother's flank, Valkyrie remained a coiled spring. Ethan watched her from his armchair, a mug of black coffee growing cold in his hands, noting how she didn't sleep so much as wait, her amber eyes tracking dust motes in the sunbeams with the intensity of a radar sweep. She wasn't behaving like a rescued stray grateful for warmth. She was acting like an operator behind enemy lines. Every time Ethan moved toward the door, she would shift her body to place herself between him and the puppies, not out of aggression, but with a calculated blocking maneuver that Ethan recognized from his own days clearing rooms in Fallujah. She didn't bark at the settling groans of the cabin. Instead, her ears would swivel independently, dissecting the sound frequencies, classifying threats with a terrifying efficiency. When he knelt to change the dressing on her flank, his fingers brushed the thick fur around her throat, revealing skin that was not just chafed, but burned. The marks were twin necrotic patches, perfectly spaced circular burns that Ethan knew all too well. They were from a high-voltage shock collar, modified to deliver agonizing continuous current, a tool of torture rather than correction. The sight made his jaw ache from clenching it. Someone hadn't been training her. They had been trying to break her. The change happened on the 4th morning, a dawn so cold it snapped the breath in your lungs. Valkyrie, who had been meticulously cleaning her pups, suddenly froze, her nose lifting to test the air current seeping through the door cracks. A low rumble started in her chest, not a growl but a vibration of pure urgency, and she limped toward the door, looking back at Ethan with a piercing, demanding stare. She whined, a sharp, high-pitched signal that grated on his nerves, and pawed frantically at the wood, ignoring her healing wounds. Ethan tried to soothe her, but she grabbed the cuff of his flannel shirt, tugging with a desperation that bordered on panic, her teeth careful not to graze his skin but firm enough to convey that this was not a request. Trusting the instincts of a fellow soldier, Ethan grabbed his parka, his heavy boots, and on a hunch retrieved his old hunting rifle from the gun safe. A weathered Remington 700 that he hadn't fired in years, slinging it over his shoulder before stepping out into the blinding glare. She didn't lead him down the easy path toward the valley. She forged a trail straight into the teeth of the wind, heading up the steep, treacherous incline of the ridgeline. The snow was waist-deep in places, and despite her recovery, Valkyrie stumbled often, her back legs trembling with effort. But whenever Ethan tried to turn back, she would drive forward with a maniacal focus, fueled by an unseen objective. They hiked for nearly 3 miles, the air thinning, the isolation absolute, until they crested a granite outcrop that overlooked a jagged ravine, usually hidden by heavy timber. Valkyrie stopped, her body going rigid as a pointer's, her gaze locked on the scene below. There, at the bottom of the sheer drop, lay a twisted metal carcass. A massive, 6-wheeled transport truck, painted a matte, unauthorized olive drab that bore no official markings. It lay on its side like a slain beast, its rear doors burst open and hanging from mangled hinges. Ethan slid down the embankment, the smell hitting him before he even reached the wreck, not just the metallic tang of spilled diesel and coolant, but the distinct, acrid bite of cordite. He approached the wreckage with his rifle raised, sweeping the interior of the cargo hold. It was lined with rows of heavy-duty steel cages, the kind used for transporting dangerous wildlife, but they were empty, their doors not unlatched but warped, as if something had smashed them open from the inside or they had been pried apart in a violent frenzy. There were no bodies, no drivers, only a smear of blood on the dashboard that had frozen into a dark ruby streak and footprints that had been mostly scrubbed away by the wind. But it was the silence of the cages that chilled him most. They were too many and too small for just dogs. He knelt by one of the cages, finding a scrap of fabric caught on a jagged rivet, a piece of tactical webbing, shredded. Valkyrie wouldn't approach the truck. She stood at the perimeter, hackles raised, growling at the empty metal shell as if it were a living monster. Ethan realized then that she hadn't just escaped a storm. She had escaped a transit, a shipment of living weapons that had gone disastrously wrong, and whatever had been in those other cages was now out there, somewhere in the vast, freezing wilderness. The tracks from the crashed transport truck were faint, scoured by the wind, but to Ethan's trained eye, they were a highway of broken twigs and crushed ice leading deep into the forbidden sector of the national forest. He moved with the fluid silence of a predator, his white parka blending into the snow, while Valkyrie limped stoically at his heel, her pain suppressed by a singular, burning need for vengeance. They tracked the trail for another mile until the dense timber opened up into a hidden depression, a natural bowl shielded by cliffs that muffled sound and blocked satellite surveillance. Below them lay what looked like an abandoned logging camp, but the smell rising from it was not sawdust or pine. It was the copper tang of blood, the ammonia of fear, and the acrid smoke of burning flesh. Ethan raised his rifle scope, his breath held tight in his chest as the scene magnified into horrifying clarity. It was a fortress of cruelty, a makeshift arena constructed from shipping containers and reinforced fencing, patrolled by men carrying assault rifles who moved with the disciplined sweep of soldiers, not random thugs. In the center of the compound stood a man who commanded the chaos, a figure that made Ethan's finger twitch on the trigger. He was a towering slab of muscle named Silas, a disgraced private military contractor whose face was a roadmap of violence. A jagged, purple chemical burn scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, twisting his mouth into a permanent, grotesque sneer that exposed gold-capped teeth. He wore unauthorized multicam fatigues stained with engine oil and dried blood, his shaved head gleaming in the winter sun, and his eyes were flat, dead things that looked upon the suffering around him with bored indifference. Silas was overseeing the destruction of evidence, directing subordinates to toss hard drives and ledgers into a burning oil drum, but the true horror was happening near the pit. A line of dogs, Belgian Malinois, Dutch Shepherds, and massive Cane Corsos were chained to a heavy rail. These weren't pets, they were warriors, clearly stolen K-9 units or discarded military assets, their bodies mapped with scars from battles fought for humans who had failed them. Ethan watched, his camera recording from the ridge as Silas raised a suppressed pistol to the head of a limping Malinois that was clearly too injured to fight anymore, ending its life with a casual efficiency that turned Ethan's stomach to ice. This was a disposal site, a breeding ground, and an execution chamber all in one. They were harvesting the genetics of heroes to breed monsters for high-stakes underground fighting rings and erasing anyone, or anything, that didn't make the cut. Ethan filmed it all, the burning documents, the cages packed with shivering dogs, the callous executions, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had enough to bury them, enough to bring down the wrath of the federal government, and he, prepared to withdraw, to fade back into the tree line and make the call. But then a sound pierced the drone of the wind and the crackle of the fire, a sharp, terrified yelp. Near the burning barrel, a crate had been kicked over, spilling a single, terrified German Shepherd puppy onto the frozen mud. It cried out, a high, desperate sound that cut through the camp's noise. Silas spun around, his eyes scanning the perimeter not with panic, but with a hunter's instinct, and in that split second, the sun glinted off the lens of Ethan's camera. "Contact! Ridgeline!" Silas roared, his voice a gravelly thunderclap, and raised his rifle in a fluid motion. The snow around Ethan exploded as rounds hammered the earth, forcing him to roll back into cover. He returned fire, his bolt-action Remington booming like a cannon compared to the rapid crack-crack-crack of the mercenaries' carbines, dropping a man who was sprinting toward the puppy. But they were flanking him, moving with professional speed, pinning him down with suppressing fire. Ethan was trapped, his ammo count low, the distance closing fast. A mercenary with a shotgun surged up the embankment, weapon raised to deliver a killing blow while Ethan struggled to cycle the bolt. Suddenly, a blurred shape launched from the snow. Valkyrie, ignoring the agony of her healing wounds and the exhaustion of the trek, exploded from the brush like a seeking missile. She didn't bark. She hit the gunman with silent, devastating force, her jaws locking onto his forearm with a bone-crushing snap that drew a scream of agony. The shotgun blasted harmlessly into the sky as the man went down under 80 pounds of maternal fury. The distraction broke the suppression just long enough. Ethan scrambled up, grabbed Valkyrie by her harness as she prepared to tear out the man's throat, and dragged her back into the deep timber. "Move! Go!" he shouted, and together they vanished into the labyrinth of the forest, leaving blood and chaos in their wake. The hunt now truly begun. The retreat from the slaughterhouse had been a blur of adrenaline and agony, a desperate scramble through the darkening timber with bullets snapping branches around their heads. But Ethan and Valkyrie had made it back to the cabin, just as the sun dipped below the peaks, turning the snow into a bruised purple. Ethan knew this wasn't a victory. It was a tactical withdrawal to a defensive position. He slammed the heavy oak door and barred it, immediately limping to the kitchen to shove the heavy cast-iron stove in front of the rear entrance. The silence of the mountain was gone, replaced by the ominous hum of approaching snowmobiles and the crackle of jammed radio frequencies. They had cut him off from the world. He was alone, wounded and outgunned, protecting a litter of 4 helpless lives against a paramilitary hit squad. With grim efficiency, Ethan pried up the floorboards to the root cellar, a cold, earthen space he used for storing venison, and ushered the whimpering puppies down into the dark. He looked at Valkyrie, intending to order her down with them, but the shepherd refused. She stood by his side, her hackles raised, her breathing ragged but her eyes burning with a cold, predatory light. She wasn't a pet to be hidden. She was his flank man. The first window shattered 10 minutes later, followed by the thwomp of a flashbang grenade that filled the living room with blinding white light and a deafening ring. Ethan, anticipating the breach, had already taken cover behind the overturned heavy oak dining table. He fired blindly into the smoke with his sidearm, a .45 caliber 1911 he had pulled from his bedside safe, dropping the first shadow that darkened the doorway. But the second wave was more cautious, led by a man who moved with the terrifying grace of an apex predator. This was Kruger, the architect of the operation, a man who didn't look like a thug, but like a corporate executioner. Tall and whippet-thin, Kruger wore high-end, charcoal-gray tactical gear that cost more than Ethan's truck, his pale, aristocratic face devoid of any emotion save for a mild annoyance at the resistance. His hair was a shock of platinum blonde, buzzed short, and his eyes were a disturbing watery blue, devoid of warmth or mercy. He didn't shout orders. He simply gestured with a gloved hand, and his men poured fire into the cabin, turning the wood walls into splinters. The firefight was a claustrophobic nightmare. Ethan moved from cover to cover, firing controlled bursts, conserving his dwindling ammunition, while Valkyrie moved like a phantom in the dust and shadows. She didn't engage directly. She waited, striking only when a mercenary got too close, hampering their movement, biting ankles and wrists before vanishing back into the dark. But attrition was against them. A lucky shot grazed Ethan's temple, blinding him with blood, and another punched through his shoulder, rendering his left arm useless. He slumped against the stone hearth, his slide, locking back on an empty chamber. The firing stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Kruger stepped through the ruined doorway, his boots crunching on glass and spent casings, a suppressed carbine raised to his shoulder. He looked at Ethan with the detached curiosity of an entomologist pinning a beetle. "Impressive," Kruger said, his voice a soft, sibilant hiss with a trace of a South African accent. "But the inventory is mine, Vance. Give me the bitch and the litter, and I'll make it quick." Ethan spat blood on the floor, his hand drifting toward the hunting knife at his belt, but he knew he was too slow, too broken. Kruger smiled, a thin stretching of lips that didn't reach his eyes, and tightened his finger on the trigger. Suddenly, a low growl vibrated through the floorboards, not from the cellar but from the shadows atop the loft stairs. Valkyrie launched herself into the air. She didn't go for the arm or the leg, she went for the throat. Kruger reacted with supernatural speed, raising his forearm to block, but he underestimated the sheer primal force of a mother defending her young. Valkyrie's jaws clamped onto the Kevlar collar of his tactical vest, her weight dragging him backward. The fabric tore with a sickening rip, exposing the vulnerable flesh of his neck. Kruger screamed, thrashing, his rifle clattering away as he tried to pry the 80-pound wolf dog off his chest. It was the opening Ethan needed. Ignoring the screaming pain in his shoulder, he lunged, driving his knife deep into the gap in Kruger's armor. The man stiffened, his eyes going wide with shock before slumping to the floor, a marionette with cut strings. Valkyrie released him instantly, stepping back to stand over the body, her chest heaving, blood matted on her muzzle, watching Ethan with a fierce, undeniable loyalty. They were battered, bleeding, and surrounded by the dead, but as Ethan looked at the dog, he saw only a soldier who had held the line. The silence that followed Kruger's death was heavy, broken only by the labored breathing of the survivors and the crackle of cooling embers in the hearth, until the rhythmic thrum, thrum, thrum of rotor blades shattered the night. Ethan had managed to splice the wires of his old shortwave radio just minutes before the first window broke, sending a broken arrow distress signal on a military frequency that he knew would be monitored. And now the cavalry had arrived not on horses, but in black Blackhawk helicopters cutting through the mountain darkness. The front door, hanging by a single hinge, was kicked open by a tactical team moving with the precision of a fluid wave, their weapon lights slicing through the gloom. At the head of the column was Special Agent Marcus Rossi, a man who looked like he had been chiseled from old leather and patience. Rossi was in his late 50s, with salt and pepper hair cut strictly to regulation, and eyes that held the weary cynicism of a man who had spent 30 years chasing monsters. He wore an FBI windbreaker over a suit that had seen better days, and his demeanor shifted from aggressive to respectful the moment he saw the carnage. He took in the body of Kruger, the shattered furniture, and finally the battered soldier and the blood-soaked shepherd standing guard over him. "Weapon down, Sergeant Vance," Rossi said, his voice calm and authoritative, recognizing a fellow professional. "We have the perimeter. You're done here." The days that followed were a blur of debriefings and medical checks, but the evidence on Ethan's camera, the footage of the slaughterhouse, the faces of the mercenaries, and the undeniable cruelty of the operation, was the hammer that shattered Kruger's empire. Based on Ethan's intel, a multi-agency task force raided the hidden logging camp within hours, catching Silas and his remaining men before they could liquidate the remaining assets. They found 42 dogs in various states of neglect, from hardened fighters to terrified bait dogs, all of whom were extracted and moved to secure veterinary facilities. Ethan was cleared of all charges. The killing of Kruger ruled as a justifiable act of defense in the face of an armed terrorist cell. The media descended on the small mountain town like vultures, hungry for the story of the hermit hero and his wolf dog, but Ethan refused every interview, every talk show offer, and every photo op. He accepted the commendation from the Bureau quietly, in a private office with the blinds drawn, and when they offered him a substantial reward for the capture of a fugitive on the sheer volume of federal warrants Kruger held, Ethan didn't buy a new truck or move to a beach. He bought lumber, fencing, and medical supplies. 6 months later, the snow had retreated to the highest peaks, replaced by the vibrant, riotous green of a Rocky Mountain spring. The cabin, once a fortress of solitude, had been transformed. The perimeter fence was repaired and reinforced, not to keep people out, but to keep the residents safe. A new sign hung over the main gate, hand-carved from reclaimed pine, the Valkyrie K9 Rehabilitation Center. It wasn't a kennel. It was a sanctuary. Ethan used the reward money and a grant from a veterans advocacy group to build a state-of-the-art run and a therapy barn. He took in the hardest cases, the dogs that the police departments couldn't handle and the shelters were too afraid to keep, the dogs, like Valkyrie, who had seen combat, trauma, and abuse. He worked with them from dawn until dusk, using the same patience he had learned as a sniper to rebuild their trust, teaching them that hands were for petting, not hurting, and that loud noises didn't always mean death. He wasn't just fixing them, they were fixing him, piece by jagged piece. On a warm afternoon, Ethan sat on the porch steps, a mug of coffee in his hand, watching the meadow. Valkyrie lay in the sun, her coat glossy and thick, the scars on her neck hidden beneath the fur, her eyes closed in contentment. Around her, 4 clumsy, exuberant puppies tumbled through the tall grass, chasing butterflies and chewing on each other's ears. They were big now, showing the intelligence and strength of their mother, but none of the fear. Ethan watched them run, a smile touching his lips, a real smile, one that reached his eyes. For years he had thought his war would never end, that the winter in his soul was permanent. But as Valkyrie lifted her head and looked at him, her tail giving a slow, rhythmic thump against the deck, Ethan realized the truth. She hadn't just dragged herself out of the snow that night to save her puppies, she had come to save him. The cold was gone. The ghosts were quiet, and for the first time in a long time, the soldier was finally home. The story of Ethan and Valkyrie serves as a powerful reminder that miracles do not always descend from the heavens with fanfare, but often find us in the quiet, desperate storms of our lives, sometimes arriving on 4 legs. Ethan believed he was the savior that night in the blizzard, yet it was he who was truly saved, pulled from the wreckage of his own solitude by a creature sent by a higher power to remind him that he was not forgotten. It teaches us that God often uses the innocent and the loyal to heal the broken, proving that even in our coldest winters we are never truly abandoned if we are willing to open our hearts. As you navigate the challenges of your daily life, remember to look for these signs of grace and the small helpers that stand beside you, for it is often through the act of caring for another that we finally heal ourselves. If this story of redemption and loyalty touched your heart, please share it with your friends and family to spread the hope. Leave a comment below about your own experiences with everyday miracles, and subscribe to our channel to join our community. May God bless you and keep you safe, guiding you through every storm you may face.